All right, everybody, we are back for the second half of this section in our cybercrime course. And we're going to be talking about the history and the process of digital forensics here in this one. So basically, people who study this for a living have divided the field of digital forensics into three phases, three time groupings, right? So in the 70s and 80s, when digital evidence first became a thing, because computers first really became a thing, there wasn't a lot of established standards. There wasn't training. It was all, this is referred to as the ad hoc phase for a reason, because there wasn't, the field hadn't really been established yet in a real structured way. Police weren't getting training. It wasn't, I talked to one police administrator who was a police officer during this time, and they had to kind of teach themselves how computers worked, how computers stored data, what evidence could be found, what evidence couldn't be found, how to look at this digital evidence in a way that courts would accept. So they were kind of entirely self-taught, right? And it wasn't until kind of the late 80s, maybe even the early 90s, that we entered the structured phase. And this was the point where now there were finally actually available tools that police could use to find different kinds of evidence. There was training that police officers could take to make them proficient and efficient at finding and obtaining this digital evidence. And most importantly, there were policies set out both by police agencies and by the courts to determine what the proper techniques are, what the proper process is, how much training should be required, how this evidence is supposed to be presented in court, etc. But now, kind of since the turn of the century, we've been in what is known as the enterprise phase, right? Now we have lots of different tools. Some of them are proprietary, i.e., they cost money. They have lots of different features, very easy to use graphical interfaces, all this fancy schmancy add-ons and features and bells and whistles. But these proprietary tools can be very expensive. I had a job at a university at one point, and we looked into purchasing some of these proprietary tools, and they were in the thousands of dollars a year kind of price point. But luckily there is also open source tools, and open source just means kind of the code for that tool is free and available to everybody, which obviously is a benefit financially because it doesn't cost a lot of money. Sometimes these open source tools don't have quite as many features. The user interface isn't quite as refined and easy to use. But because they're open source, they can be modified by specific agencies for specific purposes. They're a lot easier to acquire, a lot easier to train on, etc. This is kind of the beginning of live box forensics, i.e., we develop tools and techniques to capture memory, RAM, in running computers. And that was able to be utilized as a source of evidence for the first time. This is also when we start the process of examining digital evidence from non-computer sources, right? So not only mobile devices, but then the Internet of Things. Everything seemingly, the people who make all these different products are trying to connect them to the internet somehow. And every time that happens, that means that there's going to be some kind of digital evidence that might be found on it. Everything from thermostats to watches, health devices like the Fitbit, refrigerators, video game systems, everything connects to the internet now, and thus everything is kind of one of these potential sources for digital evidence. Even if it's just to kind of establish the timeline of when a crime happened, or with a Fitbit, if we find a murder victim wearing a Fitbit, we might be able to establish exact time of death. Even little pieces of an investigation like that might have some kind of digital evidence component. Drones are becoming more of a thing, right? People, everyday citizens, can have drones, and those drones can be used as a source of evidence. There have been numerous cases where some hobbyist was out flying a drone and they happened to capture some video or at least an image of some crime happening. Sometimes it's a sexual assault, sometimes it's a robbery, sometimes it's a burglary. And so we need to know exactly where that drone was, exactly what time it took the picture, all kinds of information that we can gather from that drone having flown over and captured different parts of a crime. And then, of course, there's automobiles, trucks, cars, motorcycles. These have more and more computers in them every year. And those computers are storing data. These are especially useful in, when the automobile is involved in some kind of accident, whether it's a hit and run or a DUI accident or, reconstructing who was at fault, kind of things. But those vehicle computers can tell you, how fast the car was going and in what direction, and whether the music was playing and whether the music was too loud, and all kinds of information can be gathered in cases that involve some kind of automobile something. Even automobile thefts are increasingly solved thanks to the GPS devices located in those vehicles. Now, this is kind of the bare bones investigation, digital forensics process, right? And we're going to get much more into the technical part of how exactly analysis happens in the next section. This is kind of the giant overall process, very kind of bird's eye view, upper level view of how this process plays out. So there are 4 main phases of the digital forensics process. The first is the survey phase, right? This is where we go out to a crime scene and we search for all the evidence we can find. Obviously, this is going to include things like, fingerprints and DNA and all the traditional evidence, but it's also, again, increasingly involving digital evidence. And 20 years ago, it was, is there a computer or a laptop at the scene of the crime? Yes or no? Now you have to look for not only those desktops and laptops, but also cell phones and tablets. And then, of course, there's the Internet of Things. What devices at or near the crime scene are going to have some kind of digital evidence? Is there a security camera in the house across the street pointed at the scene of the crime? And then also really importantly is USB drives, right? Little teeny tiny data storage doohickeys that can be hidden and disguised as dang near anything at this point, right? I've seen USB drives designed to look like sushi. I've seen USB drives designed to look like a cigarette lighter. I've seen, they can be disguised to look like dang near anything. And those are an absolutely incredible source of evidence, because people who are storing things that they know they're not supposed to have are going to try to hide them. They're going to try to put them on things that the police aren't going to find, right? But once we've kind of identified every source of digital evidence, we move into the second phase, which is the acquisition phase or collection phase. And at this point, essentially, what we're looking to do is preserve all that digital evidence. And this can happen, and the process begins usually at the crime scene, but it continues back in the digital forensics lab. And it's really, really important at this stage to document. If it's not written down, it didn't happen. Document everything. Where you found things, exactly the serial number of every device, how and when it was acquired, who did the acquisition, who did the imaging, Um, so once it's collected, once everything is documented, you want to make a copy of that digital evidence, because we never want to do our actual analysis on the original evidence just in case. What if we mess up? What if we accidentally modify something during our analysis? We want to be able to have that original that's pristine, that hasn't been messed with, that hasn't been modified, right? So because we're always aware of possible mistakes, we're never going to analyze the originals. We're going to make a copy, but not just any copy. We're going to take, if we've captured, say, a hard drive, we're going to find another hard drive that is forensically sterile, i.e., has zero information on it. We have made really, really sure that this second hard drive that we're going to put the copy on is absolutely clean of any sort of data. And then we're going to image that evidence drive, which means we're going to go in and we're going to copy every single 1 and 0 from that evidence device onto our forensically sound, forensically sterile drive. And that image is going to be what we're going to do our analysis on. And we'll talk more about this imaging process and why it's important in the next section. But for now, just know that you have to make this copy, this image, very carefully and put it on some kind of forensically sterile media for evidence integrity purposes, right? We want to make sure that it doesn't get messed up. We want to make sure our analysis doesn't accidentally change something. And then, of course, once we've created this image, once we've created this copy that we're going to do our analysis on, we need to make sure to preserve the original. And sometimes that's as easy as just making sure we put it in an anti-static evidence bag and put it in the evidence locker. But there are also things we have to worry about, say, with cell phones, right? Or anything that has the ability to connect to some outside source, whether that's through the cell phone network or Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. We need to make sure we preserve that evidence, not only in protecting it from, static and fire and water damage and all those other things, but we need to protect it from kind of the outside influence of radio waves and such. And to do that, we could use something like a Faraday cage, which is just a fancy metal container that blocks, cell phone signals and Wi-Fi signals and so on. We need to make sure we preserve the original, just in case something does happen with our image, with our copy. We can make another copy. So then once we have our image, once we have our, forensically sterile media with that new fancy image of the evidence on it, now we can do our analysis. And we're going to talk all about what to do in this analysis process in the next section. But this is, the fancy computer things where we take that image, we put it into a software system, we do all kinds of looking through it to see what digital evidence we can find and mark. And then once that analysis process is complete, the fourth stage of the investigation process is reporting. So once again, I hope you documented everything at all these prior stages, because now it's time to give all that documentation, all the evidence you found, all the proof that, the chain of evidence was maintained and analysis was done properly according to law and policy. All that has to be given to the prosecutor, and they will use that report, all that documentation, to determine whether charges should be filed, what charges should be filed, whether to offer or accept a plea deal, etc., etc. But importantly, if the case goes to trial, this reporting phase may involve the digital forensics examiner having to testify. And the testimony in court is one of the most difficult parts of the job, because the jury is 12 people who have no idea what the heck you're talking about, right? Unless you get real lucky, the people on the jury barely know how to work a computer, let alone how to interpret different pieces of evidence and why imaging is important and all these other factors. So you're going to have to sit there on a witness stand and explain in really simple language what you did, how you did it, why it's, kind of interpreted the way that it should be interpreted, and it doesn't mean this other thing that the other lawyer is going to try to convince the jury of. And So you have to be able to explain this really complicated process, in a very short amount of time to 12 people who probably have no clue what the heck you're talking about. So being able to do that kind of effectively, being able to communicate these complicated processes and these complicated factors involved in digital forensics, that's really one of the toughest parts of being a digital forensics analyst. All right, that's the end of this section. In the next section, we're going to go much deeper dive into the analysis part of that process. We're going to get a little bit technical, but it's going to be a heck of a lot of fun. Thank you guys so much for watching this. I'll see you.